6:14 a.m., April 9th, 2026. San Pedro, California. Father Daniel Reyes stepped off the shuttle bus at Berth 121 of the Port of Los Angeles, his navy blue chaplain's vest already buttoned against the morning fog. Left hand, a thermos of coffee. Right hand, a canvas bag with paper cups, a Spanish-language Bible, and a pocket-sized English Tagalog phrasebook worn soft at the spine. He had done this walk every other Tuesday for 3 years. The vessel he was approaching that morning was the Shahab-e Khalij, an Iranian-flagged commercial tanker, 244 meters in length, registered under a Cypriot holding entity. It had arrived at San Pedro under unusual circumstances, intercepted 41 nautical miles off the coast 2 days earlier by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter operating under CENTCOM maritime enforcement protocols, then escorted into port for inspection. The harbor master's log read, "Diverted for cargo compliance review." Among dock workers who had watched it come in under escort, the description was shorter. "That one came in hot," a longshore supervisor would later say. "Didn't look like a routine stop to us." It wasn't. Father Reyes didn't know any of that yet. He knew only what the port liaison had told him during the morning briefing. Iranian crew, possible language barriers, offer translation support if needed. Standard intake. The Chaplain program at the Port of Los Angeles existed for exactly these situations. A civilian presence, non-law enforcement, meant to offer pastoral contact to foreign sailors who might otherwise spend days in port without speaking to anyone outside their chain of command. Reyes was fluent in Spanish and Tagalog, functional in Arabic, and had picked up enough Bahasa Indonesia over 3 years of dock visits to manage a greeting, a question about family, and a prayer if it was wanted. He was not trained to investigate. He was not there to investigate. But what Father Daniel Reyes noticed at 6:41 a.m., 47 steps down the main corridor of the Shahab-e Khalij's crew deck, would trigger a federal operation involving 4 agencies, 2 sovereign governments, and a network of debt bondage stretching from the docks of Los Angeles back through Manila, Dhaka, and the logistics offices of a Dubai-registered shipping firm with OFAC sanctions flags going. Back to 2022. 8 men. 1 padlock. 1 priest who asked why. The investigation case number assigned later by HSI's Los Angeles field office was HSI LA 2026-0817. The charge sheet, unsealed in May 2026, ran to 63 pages. The shell company at the center of it was registered in Nicosia, Cyprus, under a name that translated loosely from Greek as Southern Horizon Maritime Services. None of that existed yet when Reyes knocked on the door of the crew mess at 6:44 a.m. He was just there for the coffee. Let's back up. The Port of Los Angeles is the largest container port in the Western Hemisphere. In 2025, it processed approximately 9 million 20-foot equivalent units, a number that requires a pause to visualize. At any given moment, somewhere between 30 and 80 vessels are either docked, anchored in the outer harbor, or transiting in and out of the main channel. The port employs over 16,000 people directly and generates an estimated $50 billion in annual economic activity. It is also one of the most surveilled, inspected, and documented pieces of real estate on the planet. U.S. Customs and Border Protection maintains a dedicated port unit. Homeland Security Investigations runs regular cargo sweeps. The Coast Guard has a presence at both the outer channel and the inner berths. Fixed cameras at every gate, every crane bay, every terminal access point. And yet, 86% of incoming cargo containers are cleared without physical inspection. The logistics of doing otherwise, unloading, rescreening, restacking every box on every ship that arrives, would shut the port down within 72 hours. The inspection system is risk-based and intelligence-driven. If your paperwork is clean, your cargo code is routine, and your vessel's prior port history doesn't trigger a flag, you move through. The Shahab-e Khalij had been moving through for 14 months. Between mid-2025 and April 2026, the vessel made 9 documented stops at Pacific ports: Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, Honolulu. 2 stops at Vancouver. It was registered to carry industrial lubricants, machine parts, and bulk agricultural commodities, categories with some of the least intensive inspection protocols in the Port Authority's matrix. The vessel had passed CBP cargo review on every previous visit. Its manifests were consistent. Its paperwork was, to use the phrase that would appear 4 times in the eventual HSI case memo, unremarkable. The Shahab-e Khalij had also, on each of those 9 stops, carried additional cargo that appeared on no manifest: human beings. The scheme, as federal prosecutors would eventually reconstruct it, was neither complicated nor particularly innovative. It was simply old. Debt bondage as a mechanism for maritime labor exploitation goes back centuries. What the network operating through the Shahab-e Khalij had done was update the logistics, routing recruitment through WhatsApp networks in Bangladesh and Indonesia, processing placement fees through mobile payment platforms like GoPay and bCash, and using a layered corporate structure to insulate the beneficial owners from any direct contact with the men they were trafficking. Here is how it worked. A recruiter, operating in Dhaka or in secondary cities in West Java, would approach a young man, typically between the ages of 22 and 35, typically with limited formal education and significant family financial pressure. The recruiter would present an opportunity: a berth on an international commercial vessel, guaranteed wages, 6 to 8 months at sea, return travel covered. Total initial cost to the worker, $6,000, deducted from wages over the first 12 months of employment. $6,000. In regions where the median monthly household income runs between $150 and $280, that sum represents years of savings. Families would take out loans to pay it. Some would sell land. Some would borrow from the recruiter himself at interest rates that weren't disclosed until the contract was signed, and sometimes not until the ship was already at sea. The contracts themselves were documents produced in English and, occasionally, in a simplified Malay that Indonesian recruits later told federal investigators was not quite right, like it was translated by a machine and nobody checked it. The contracts specified wages that were never paid in full. They specified accommodation and meal provisions that were never provided at the contracted standard. They specified dispute resolution mechanisms that required written complaints submitted in English, in triplicate, to an address in Cyprus that, when investigators eventually visited it in May 2026, turned out to be a mail drop inside a stationery store on the outskirts of Nicosia. The men who signed these contracts were told they would work as sailors, deckhands, engine room assistants, general crew. Some had prior maritime experience, some had none. The Shahab-e Khalij was not a vessel that required a highly skilled crew for its stated operations. It carried cargo, it moved between ports, it didn't need specialists. What it needed were people who couldn't leave. Phones were collected at embarkation, the official explanation given to recruits, communications, security, standard policy on vessels operating near Iranian territorial waters. The actual purpose was simpler. A man without a phone cannot call his family. A man who cannot call his family cannot report what is happening to him. A man who cannot report what is happening to him is, for practical purposes, invisible. Placement fees that were supposed to end after 12 months were extended. New fees were added. Equipment costs, documentation processing, port accommodation surcharges. Each man on the Shahab-e Khalij arrived at the port of Los Angeles in April 2026 owing more than he had when he boarded. 8 of them. The thing about this case, and this is what most people miss when they hear maritime trafficking, is that the victims weren't hidden in a container. They weren't sealed in a compartment. They were crew, listed in some capacity on the vessel's documentation. They were just crew who were not permitted to leave the ship, not permitted to communicate with the outside world, and not permitted to know that anything they were experiencing was illegal. Several had been told that their debt obligations, if challenged, could result in their families back home being held responsible by the placement agency. One man, identified in court documents only as Subject 4, a 29-year-old from Chittagong, had been told that the placement agency held a lien on his mother's house. He believed it. He had no reason not to. I spent time going through the case file, and one detail kept pulling me back: the supply room. Not the trafficking scheme itself. The mechanics of that are, tragically, well documented. The specific detail I kept returning to was the supply room, the padlock, the food tray. Because here's what's most surprising about this case. It wasn't a tip. It wasn't surveillance. It wasn't an informant who flipped. It was a volunteer chaplain who noticed that a padlock was on the outside of a door. Father Daniel Reyes completed his initial walk of the crew deck at approximately 6:59 a.m. He had spoken briefly with 3 crew members, 2 Pakistanis and 1 Omani, who accepted coffee and declined pastoral conversation. Standard. He had noted that the crew mess was understocked, that several bunks in the forward sleeping quarters appeared unused but recently slept in, blankets wrinkled, pillows indented, and that the general atmosphere on the ship was, in his own words as later recorded in his HSI statement, quiet in the wrong way. He had seen quiet ships before. Ships where the crew was exhausted from a long crossing and wanted only sleep. Ships where the crew was wary of outsiders, a cultural disposition, occasionally religious, never a red flag on its own. This felt different. He couldn't quantify it. He noted it and kept walking. At the far end of the crew deck, past the engine room access stairwell, was a door marked in English and Farsi, Spipi Alai/Stores, Authorized Personal Only, standard designation. Reyes had walked past dozens of identical doors on dozens of vessels. This one had a padlock on the hasp, not unusual in itself. Supply rooms were typically secured. What was unusual was that the padlock was on the outside. A supply room secured from the outside is a supply room that can only be opened by someone who is not inside it. That is the functional purpose of a padlock on an exterior hasp. It keeps something in, not something out. Reyes stopped. He looked at the door. He noted the padlock. He noted that the hasp had been recently installed. The screws were shiny, the metal around them not yet oxidized. He looked at the floor in front of the door. There was a food tray on the floor. A metal cafeteria tray with the remnants of a meal. Rice, something protein-based, 2 empty water bottles. The tray had been slid partway under the door and partway out. Someone inside had pushed the empty tray out. Father Reyes stood in that corridor for approximately 4 seconds. Then he walked back to the gangway and asked the port liaison officer to call CBP. He didn't call law enforcement himself. He called his diocese. The port liaison called CBP. And what happened next is a textbook case of how civilian observation, institutional channels, and federal coordination can collapse a 14-month operation in 72 hours. And also how close this entire thing came to falling apart at the seams. The CBP officer who responded to the initial report at 7:22 a.m. was a border protection inspector named Castellano. He reviewed the supply room door, confirmed the exterior padlock, and noted the food tray. His initial inclination, as he would later describe it, was to treat this as a customs hold issue. Vessels occasionally seal cargo holds or storage areas during inspections as a condition of their loading manifest. He consulted the ship's officer on duty, a first mate who explained, in functional English, that the supply room had been secured due to a damaged locking mechanism on the interior handle. A precaution. Nothing inside. Everything was in order. Castellano made a note. He did not break the seal. This is the obstacle that nearly ended the investigation before it started. He flagged the notation for his shift supervisor, a CBP port director named Alvarez, who reviewed it at 8:04 a.m. and made a different call. Alvarez had 17 years in maritime inspection. He had seen exterior locks on interior compartments before. It happened. It was unusual enough, given the vessel's circumstances, diverted under escort, under enhanced review, that he wanted it opened. The first mate declined to produce a key. Alvarez escalated to HSI at 8:31 a.m. At 9:15 a.m., a 3-person HSI rapid assessment team arrived at berth 121. The team lead was an HSI supervisory agent named Miriam Kowalczyk, who had spent the previous 4 years in HSI's human trafficking division. She reviewed Castellano's notes, Alvarez's escalation, and the original report from Father Reyes's call to the port liaison. She requested the key again. The first mate said it was with the captain. The captain, she was told, was resting and not available. Kowalczyk noted the time, 9:23 a.m., and issued a formal CBP administrative hold on the Shahab-e Khalij, effective immediately, preventing any crew or cargo from departing the vessel. Then she called her field supervisor to request emergency warrant authorization. The warrant came through at 11:47 a.m. At 12:03 p.m., the supply room door was opened with bolt cutters. Inside, 8 men, seated on the floor or on overturned storage crates. The room was approximately 12 feet by 14 feet. No window. The air was stale. The men ranged in age. Investigators would later determine from 24 to 41. 6 were Bangladeshi nationals. 2 were Indonesian. None of them spoke when the door opened. Several flinched away from the light. One of them. Subject 2, a 33-year-old from Bandung, later told federal investigators through an interpreter that he had been in that room for approximately 19 hours. He had been placed there when the vessel was escorted into port. He was told it was temporary. He was not told why. He had received 2 trays of food through the door. He had shared the water with the other men. At some point during the night, he had assumed no one was coming. He was wrong about that. What followed was a 72-hour operational period that HSI's Los Angeles field office would later classify as a Priority 1 crimes against children and trafficking activation. The designation isn't just procedural. It unlocks interagency coordination protocols that compress timelines. Within 4 hours of the supply room being opened, HSI had a full investigative team on site. Within 6 hours, the FBI's Civil Rights Unit had assigned a coordinator. Within 12 hours, 3 of the 8 men had been connected with federal victim services and had given preliminary statements through certified interpreters. The ship's captain, a 52-year-old Iranian national identified in court documents as Mohammad Farrokhzad, was taken into CBP administrative custody at 1:14 p.m. on April 9th. He requested a lawyer. He did not speak further. The first mate was detained separately. He spoke more freely, but not helpfully. He said he had been told the men in the supply room were stowaways discovered at sea. He said the captain had ordered them held pending Port Authority notification. He said he had been following orders. Federal investigators noted his statement. They did not find it credible. The vessel's communications logs, downloaded under the Administrative Hold Authority, told a different story. CENTCOM records for the Shahab-e Khalij showed a series of encrypted messages sent in the 12 hours before the vessel reached the port inspection zone. The messages were routed through a commercial maritime communications provider and addressed to an account that HSI's Digital Forensics Unit traced, within 48 hours, to a logistics coordinator registered to the Cyprus-based entity. The content of those messages, partially decoded, included what federal investigators described in case notes as instructions to isolate non-manifested personnel prior to arrival. Non-manifested personnel. 8 men who were not supposed to be there, according to the paperwork. 8 men who had been on the ship for, in some cases, months. 8 men whose contracts with the placement agency had been issued under a company name that shared a registered address in Jakarta with 4 other entities. All of them dissolved, reformed, and dissolved again over the previous 3 years in a pattern that Indonesian labor enforcement officials had flagged without action. Here's the take that will probably get some pushback. The failure here wasn't the captain. The captain is facing federal charges. He's going to prison. The failure was in the 14 months before April 9th, 9 port visits, routine clearances, a vessel with a documented labor complaint history. Indonesian maritime regulators had received 2 anonymous complaints in late 2025, both unresolved, moving freely through Pacific ports because its paperwork was unremarkable. The demand side of maritime labor trafficking does not exist in isolation. It exists because the supply chain that moves industrial lubricants and machine parts from one port to another is optimized for efficiency, not for the welfare of the people operating the ships that carry them. That is not a conspiratorial claim. It is a structural one. The investigation that opened on April 9th would eventually reach far beyond Captain Farrokhzad. The Cyprus entity, Southern Horizon Maritime Services, was traced through a chain of 3 nominee directors to a Dubai-registered logistics firm, Halcyon Maritime Partners FCCO. Halcyon had appeared on an OFAC advisory list in June 2022, flagged for potential sanctions evasion related to Iranian shipping interests. The flag was an advisory, not a designation, meaning it did not legally prevent U.S. entities from transacting with Halcyon, but it was supposed to trigger enhanced due diligence from any port authority handling vessels with Halcyon connections. The Port of Los Angeles had processed vessels linked to Halcyon entities on at least 3 documented occasions between 2023 and 2026. The OFAC advisory had not been cross-referenced against the vessel arrival manifest in any of those cases. That cross-referencing gap is now the subject of a separate Department of Homeland Security internal review. And here is where the chaplain's path and the federal machinery intersect in a way worth pausing on. Father Reyes called his diocese because that was what he was trained to do. The chaplain program at the Port of Los Angeles explicitly instructs its volunteers. If you observe something concerning, report it to your coordinator, not directly to law enforcement. The reasoning is pastoral. A chaplain's value in port communities depends on being perceived as non-adversarial. Calling the FBI the moment you see something unusual destroys the trust that makes chaplaincy work. So Reyes called the diocesan port ministry coordinator. The coordinator called the port liaison. The port liaison called CBP. 3 handoffs. Approximately 48 minutes of elapsed time between Reyes's observation and the first CBP response. 48 minutes is fast. In bureaucratic terms, 48 minutes is extraordinary. But here is the detail that sat with investigators long after the case closed. The observation almost didn't make it. The Diocesan Port Ministry coordinator who received Father Reyes' call that morning was not the regular coordinator. The regular coordinator was on bereavement leave. The call was handled by a bishop's aide named Patricia Villard, who had been covering Port Ministry administrative duties for 3 weeks and who, the previous evening, had been working through a stack of correspondence sitting in the coordinator's inbox. In that correspondence was a printout of a mutual legal assistance request forwarded from the Indonesian National Police through Interpol to the FBI's Los Angeles field office, then circulated to diocesan victim outreach coordinators as part of an awareness protocol. The request referenced 8 missing persons. Men reported missing by their families in Indonesia and Bangladesh after losing contact with a vessel described as operating in Pacific shipping lanes. The families had been reporting for months. The cases had been logged. No one had connected them to any specific vessel. Villard had read that printout the night before. When Reyes' call came in describing 8 men in a locked supply room on an Iranian tanker at San Pedro, she connected it in under 90 seconds. She called CBP directly. She referenced the Interpol case number in the call. That case number flagged a priority response that Castellano's initial report alone would not have triggered. If the regular coordinator had taken the call, that Interpol printout might have been in a different stack. The escalation might have been slower. Villard had read the right document the night before by accident. One degree of coincidence, separating an administrative hold from a routine notation. Put yourself in Castellano's position for a second. Standing in front of that door at 7:22 in the morning, food tray on the floor, ship's officer telling you it's a damaged lock mechanism, nothing to see, everything's fine. Would you have pushed it? Or would you have made the note and moved on to the next berth? The men in that room didn't know any of this was happening. They didn't know Father Reyes had seen the tray. They didn't know Patricia Villard had connected the call to an Interpol case number. They didn't know an HSI team was assembling outside. Subject 4. The man from Chittagong, the one who believed the placement agency held a lien on his mother's house, later told investigators he had started to pray at around 10 a.m. Not for rescue. He said he had stopped believing in rescue by that point. He was praying for the strength to face what came next. What came next was bolt cutters and daylight. The 72-hour operation that followed the supply room opening on April 9th was not a single raid. It was a cascading sequence of warrants, detentions, and interviews conducted across 4 jurisdictions. Here is the sequence. April 9th, 2:30 p.m. HSI LA issues an administrative hold and begins victim interviews with certified interpreters. The FBI Civil Rights Unit coordinator, Special Agent Tamara Nichols, arrives at the port and establishes lead federal jurisdiction under 18 U.S.C. Section 1589, forced labor, and Section 1592, unlawful conduct with respect to documents. The ship's captain is in CBP custody. April 9th, 6 p.m. HSI Digital Forensics completes the initial download of the Shahab-e Khalij communications log. The encrypted CENTCOM messages are flagged for decryption analysis. A separate unit begins tracing the Cyprus entity registration. April 10th, 8:45 a.m. The Department of Justice National Security Division is looped in after the OFAC advisory connection to Halcyon Maritime Partners is confirmed. This triggers a parallel sanctions investigation running alongside the trafficking case. April 10th, 2:15 p.m. 3 of the 8 victims have given formal statements. The statements are consistent on the core facts: recruitment through a WhatsApp-based placement agency, payment of a $6,000 initial placement fee, forfeiture of phones at embarkation, escalating debt claims at sea, confinement in the supply room beginning approximately 19 hours before the ship reached port. April 10th, 7:30 p.m. An obstacle. The federal translator assigned to work with the 6 Bangladeshi nationals is unable to reach the port due to a vehicle accident on the 110 freeway. HSI's Los Angeles office has a backup protocol, a telephone interpretation service used for emergency immigration proceedings. But phone-based interpretation slows the interview process significantly. 3 of the 6 Bangladeshi nationals' statements are not completed until the following morning. The investigation does not stop, but the delay affects the timeline for a material witness warrant that HSI had intended to execute before Captain Farrokhzad's attorney requested a bail hearing. The bail hearing is granted anyway. The bail request is denied. April 11th, 9 a.m. The full interview record for all 8 men is complete. Federal investigators have established, from victim statements alone, a consistent operational pattern covering at least 14 months and at least 3 separate recruitment cycles. Subject 7, a 41-year-old from a village outside Surabaya, told investigators he had been on the vessel for 11 months. He was the longest held of the 8. He had been told, when the recruitment cycle refreshed 6 months in, that new workers were being brought on and that his placement fee had been extended to cover their recruitment costs. He was, in effect, paying for the recruitment of the men who would work alongside him. Subject 7 is the element of this case that, even after reviewing the full case file, does not become easier to sit with. This is where the investigation pivoted. What had begun as a chaplain's observation, padlock, food tray, was now a federal case with victim testimony establishing a trafficking network. The next question was scale. How many routes? How many vessels? How many men? The answer to those questions was still being assembled when a second breakthrough came, not from the communications log but from a source investigators had not anticipated. The placement agency's own accounting records. One of the 8 men. Subject 3, a 27-year-old from Dhaka, had, before his phone was confiscated at embarkation, taken a series of photographs of documents he was given to sign. He had done this not because he suspected fraud. He was meticulous by nature, he told investigators, and his older brother had warned him to keep copies of everything. The photographs were stored in his phone's cloud backup, linked to a secondary Gmail account his recruiter did not know about. Federal investigators accessed that cloud backup through a legal process order. The photographs included 3 pages of a placement agreement, an addendum specifying escalating fee structures, and, most significantly, a payment routing document showing the full chain of entities used to process the initial $6,000 fee. That routing document became the spine of the financial investigation. The chain ran: worker, local mobile payment platform, Bcash, Bangladesh regional aggregator registered in Singapore, offshore clearing account in Hong Kong, final disbursement to a holding account registered to a Cypriot nominee director linked to Southern Horizon Maritime Services. Each step in the chain was, individually, a legitimate-looking financial transaction. Money moving from a mobile platform in Dhaka to a Singapore aggregator is not, by itself, suspicious. Thousands of international remittances follow similar paths. The pattern only became visible when you mapped all 8 victims' payment histories and found that they all terminated at the same Hong Kong account. Financial intelligence analysts at HSI's Bulk Cash Smuggling and Money Laundering Division estimated that the total value of placement fees processed through this chain across all identified recruitment cycles since mid-2025 was approximately $2, $7 million. That figure covered 8 men across 3 identified cycles. Investigators assessed that additional recruitment cycles, not yet fully documented, could bring the total to somewhere between $4 million and $5. $5 million. The network was bigger than the 8 men in the supply room. By how much, federal investigators were still working to determine when charges were unsealed. What do you think? Did the system fail these men? Or was this always going to happen as long as the paperwork was clean? Drop your answer in the comments. The gap between what the inspection system is designed to catch and what it actually catches in practice. That gap is a policy choice, and it's worth the question. May 14th, 2026. The Department of Justice unsealed a 19-count indictment against Captain Mohammed Farrokhzad, the Cypriot entity Southern Horizon Maritime Services, and 3 individual co-conspirators identified in the investigation. The charges included forced labor, document servitude, international transportation for forced labor, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The 3 individual co-conspirators were a logistics coordinator based in Jakarta, identified as the point of contact for recruitment operations, a financial intermediary based in Singapore, identified as the operator of the regional aggregator account, and a 3rd individual, identified only in the indictment as co-conspirator 3, described as holding a beneficial ownership interest in Halcyon Maritime Partners FZCO. That individual is believed to be based in Dubai. As of the date of this broadcast, an international arrest warrant has been issued. The individual has not been located. 1 fugitive, not recovered. Captain Farrokhzad faces a maximum sentence of 20 years on the forced labor count alone. His trial date has not been set. The 8 men from the supply room have been designated as material witnesses. 7 of them are cooperating with prosecutors. Subject 4. The man from Chittagong has applied for special immigrant juvenile status, a legal pathway that will require additional court proceedings. His application is pending. His mother's house is fine. The lien was not real. It never was. The ship itself, the Shahab-e Khalij, remains under a federal administrative hold at Berth 121. Its cargo, Industrial lubricants and machine parts, consistent with the manifest, was released after CBP inspection. The vessel itself has not been released. Its future disposition is part of an ongoing asset forfeiture proceeding. The recruitment WhatsApp network that sourced workers for this scheme has been identified but not fully dismantled. Indonesian and Bangladeshi labor enforcement officials have been notified through Interpol channels. As of early July 2026, the specific accounts used to recruit the 8 men have been deactivated. New accounts, operating under slightly different names, were identified by Indonesian digital investigators within 3 weeks. The recruitment infrastructure did not disappear. It adapted. One detail that continues to sit with investigators: Subject 7, the 41-year-old from Surabaya, the one who had been on the vessel longest. He told his interviewer, on April 11th, through the phone interpreter, that there had been other men before him. Other cycles, other workers, some of whom had been on the ship when he joined and had since been cycled off. He did not know where they went. He did not know their names. He knew their faces. Federal investigators have identified 2 prior recruitment cycles with partial documentation. There is a 3rd cycle, estimated to predate the others, for which no documentation has been recovered. The individuals from that cycle have not been located. There is money that was not recovered. There are routes that were not mapped. There are men who were on that vessel before April 2026 whose current whereabouts are unknown. The supply room at Berth 121 has been photographed, documented, and released as part of the federal evidentiary record. The padlock, serial number preserved, chain of custody logged, sits in an evidence locker at the HSI Los Angeles field office. Father Daniel Reyes returned to doc ministry the following Tuesday. He was interviewed by HSI investigators and provided a written statement. He has not been publicly named in connection with the case. The Port Liaison's call is documented as the formal origination of the federal report, and Reyes, consistent with Chaplain program protocols, is not identified in case filings as a reporting party. He is referenced only as a civilian chaplain volunteer. He has continued doing the walk every other Tuesday. If you want to understand how the federal response to maritime trafficking has changed since this case, and whether the structural gaps in cargo inspection are being addressed, that's the next question, and it's the one prosecutors are watching more carefully than they're saying publicly. Subscribe so you don't miss it when we get there. The network is dismantled. The infrastructure that built it is still operating. The demand that funded it has not changed. A supply room, a padlock, a food tray on the floor, 8 men who were not supposed to be findable, 1 volunteer who walked down the wrong corridor on the right morning. The case is active. The search continues. Comment yes or no. Do you think the maritime inspection gap will be closed before this happens again at a major U? S-port? We read every comment.